It happened quietly. One night in 2008, the global economy stood just 3 hours away from total failure, and almost no one knew. The reason a single building held the fate of every nation lies buried in the long, hidden story of central banks. It began, as these things often do, on a night that looked completely ordinary. New York traffic had thinned, office towers stood mostly dark, and the city felt strangely peaceful for a Thursday. But inside the Federal Reserve Building, far past the hour when even traders stopped checking their screens, the lights were still burning. Most people sleeping in their apartments had no idea that the world's financial lungs were failing, quietly, quickly, and almost fatally. In a conference room on the 6th floor, the atmosphere felt heavy, the kind of silence where every small sound seems too loud. Papers were stacked on the table, screens glowed with red numbers, and a group of exhausted people watched markets freeze in real time. A senior official leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "If this doesn't stop by morning," he murmured, "ATMs might not function. Payrolls won't go out. Credit markets will flatline." Another voice answered, "Then we aren't talking about a recession. We're talking about a breakdown of the system." It was 2:43 a.m. They were hours away from deciding whether the world economy lived or died. And yet, no cameras recorded this moment. No headlines revealed what was being discussed. Just a handful of people, a sealed room, and the most powerful financial institution humanity has ever created, a central bank. Most people imagine central banks as calm places where economists debate inflation and unemployment. But nights like this show their real purpose. When a crisis strikes and governments freeze, when panic spreads faster than information, and when ordinary tools stop working, central banks step in. Not with speeches or promises, but with actions that can move trillions of dollars in the time it takes someone to refresh a screen. To understand how we reached this point, how unelected institutions came to hold this kind of responsibility, you have to go back centuries to another crisis, another government, another room filled with quiet urgency. In the late 1600s, England was running out of money. Wars had drained the treasury, gold reserves were disappearing, and creditors were refusing to lend. The government was technically functioning, but only because it hid how desperate things had become. Then a group of wealthy financiers walked in with a proposal that would reshape the financial world forever. "We will lend you the money," they said, "but grant us the right to establish a bank that issues money backed solely by the promise of the state." It was an unprecedented idea, and it became the birth of the Bank of England in 1694, the first modern central bank. This moment wasn't a noble effort to create financial stability. It was a negotiation between desperation and opportunity. But it revealed something that would define the next 3 centuries. Whoever controls the creation of money controls the fate of the nation. And once governments realized that power, they could no longer imagine ruling without it. Central banks spread across Europe as empires expanded. While the public saw flags, armies, and grand speeches, behind it all were institutions that made wars possible, stabilized currencies, and kept states functioning when treasuries were empty. Crises weren't interruptions of the system, they were fuel for its evolution. Every panic strengthened central banks. Every collapse expanded their authority. When the United States created the Federal Reserve in 1913, it adopted a distinctive model, neither fully public nor fully private, but something in between. It was designed to insulate decisions from politics while still serving public goals. The Fed became a strange kind of power, independent enough to act boldly, yet connected enough to influence the entire economy. During World War I, it financed enormous government borrowing. During the Great Depression, its failure to act decisively contributed to the crisis, and therefore led to it gaining even more authority afterward. This pattern would repeat again and again: chaos, then reform, then expansion of power. By the end of World War II, the world needed a new monetary order. At Bretton Woods in 1944, representatives from dozens of countries gathered in a remote hotel to redraw the global financial map. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Leaders debated currencies, exchange rates, and how to prevent another global depression. Publicly, politicians delivered the speeches, but privately, central bankers shaped the architecture. The system they created tied all major currencies to the US dollar and tied the dollar to gold. For a while, this created stability, until it didn't. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars in circulation globally than the United States had gold to redeem. Confidence cracked. Nations lined up demanding gold in exchange for dollars. Pressure built until finally, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the end of the gold standard on live television. The world shifted overnight from money backed by metal to money backed by belief. And in a belief-based system, central banks became the guardians of that belief. The following years tested that trust. The 1970s brought oil shocks, soaring prices, and inflation that felt unstoppable. Interest rates rose to levels few imagined possible. Factories closed, unemployment rose, and households struggled. But central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker, made a choice: crush inflation no matter the cost. Rates climbed over 20%. The medicine was harsh, but it worked. And it demonstrated once more that central banks had the power not just to support economies, but to reshape them entirely. Through the 1980s and 1990s, central banks became synonymous with stability. When currencies collapsed in emerging markets, central banks intervened. When speculative bubbles formed, central banks monitored them. When governments overspent, central banks pressured them to adjust. Their influence grew steadily, quietly, through decisions made in meeting rooms ordinary people never saw. Then came 2008, the night when markets froze and credit vanished. As banks failed and the financial system cracked open, central banks crossed a line that had never been crossed before. They created money in amounts previously unimaginable, pumping liquidity into every corner of the global economy. Entire markets survived because of decisions made in hours, not months. Politicians debated publicly, but the real rescue happened through central banking. And then 2020 arrived. The world faced a crisis no spreadsheet had predicted. Economies shut down overnight. Trade halted. Millions lost incomes. Once again, central banks moved instantly, cutting rates, buying assets, stabilizing markets, and supporting governments as they borrowed at historic levels. For the first time, nearly every major central bank on Earth acted in harmony. Globalization was no longer just about products crossing borders. It was about synchronized monetary action, holding the world together. So how do these pieces fit? What does this long, quiet history reveal about the present moment? Central banks don't control everything. They cannot prevent every crisis, nor do they try to. But they determine how fast crises spread, who is rescued, which institutions survive, and how societies recover. They decide the shape of the future long before most people realize the future is being shaped. This isn't conspiracy, it is structure. It is the architecture of modern capitalism, built slowly, decision by decision, crisis by crisis. A system in which the most consequential choices often happen far from public view, not because someone is hiding them, but because they must be made quickly, technically, and without political delay. Every crisis has a public story, charts, headlines, angry debates. But the deeper story, the one that actually determines what happens next, unfolds in quiet rooms. Rooms like the one in 2008, where tired people stared at screens and understood that a wrong move could change history. The noise of the crisis is public. The decisions that matter most are not.